wonder, have you thought about what's going to happen as you age? As you begin to lose your memory, your mobility, and your hearing? Who's going to look after you? Who's going to look after your parents when they age? As we get older, we lose our social connections and all the familiar people. Families change. Our children move away to live lives of their own. Friends and family die. Increasing globalization means that we can choose where we live, we can change where we live, we can go anywhere in the world. And for older people, hope is replaced by fear and hopelessness. We have increasing isolation of older people. As I was putting this talk together, my mind went back to my days as a student physiotherapist and my first geriatric placement. That term geriatric is a term I don't like. I didn't like it then, and I don't like it now. And the reason is, it just strikes me that it's about being incapable. I recall, as I walked up to my first placement as a student, and I reached the door of the geriatric ward, the first thing that hit me was the smell of stale urine. It's a smell that stays with you, and it's one I've never forgotten. When I stepped onto the ward, and I looked down the ward, what I saw was 2 long rows of old people. Some of them drooling, some of them calling out, but busy staff could not attend to them. Wind the clock forwards 40 years or so, and what do we have? We have modern wards. We have modern residential homes. And I look at the residential homes that I visit, and I visit standard residential homes, and I think, are these places where I would want to spend the rest of my life? And regrettably, the answer is no. And I have to ask myself why. I see them as depressing, institutionalized, and lonely places. So what is it that I'm looking for? What would I want in a home? And the opportunity came to answer this question when I was approached by a TV company to look at what we might do to improve the lives of older people. And that's why I'm standing here tonight, to share with you what I've come to know and what I think would make a big difference to us as we age. Projects in the United States have been looking at how we can manage this. I'm here to share their experiences, and what we wanted to do was to do an experiment that used those experiences and introduce a nursery into an old people's home. When I think about a nursery in an old people's home, some of you might be raising an eyebrow. We did this experiment, my colleagues and I, a researcher and a geriatrician, and what we wanted to do was to take some measurements to see what difference it could make. So before the experiment started, we did baseline measurements. We looked at older people and their mood. We looked at their strength. We looked at their physical activity. I did a test that measured the time they took to get out of their chair, walk 3 meters, walk back to the chair, and sit down. A timed up-and-go test, it's called. We also looked at their ability to look after themselves. Many of the older people talked about despair. How despairing, no hope for the future. And I wondered, what difference would this make? We measured their baseline measurements at 3 weeks and at the end of 6 weeks. We introduced activities with the children There were indoor activities, outdoor activities, tabletop activities, arts and crafts, a variety of things. And most of these older people engaged well. What did we find? Well, at the end of 6 weeks, there was an extraordinary, an amazing turnaround. When we had measured the older people, as I said, most of them were depressed, and too significantly so. When we remeasured them, none of them were depressed. They spoke of hope for the future. They were more physically active. They joined in an intergenerational sports day, a sports day. There they were, competing on the lawns of the home with their 4-year-old. Not just competing, running. One resident said he can't remember the last time he ran. One gentleman, I recall, at the start of the experiment said, "This is a waste of time. It's not going to work." And there he was, playing sleeping lions on the floor with the 4-year-olds. Something we didn't set out to measure was touch. And I mention it here because it's something the residents shared with us. One resident said she couldn't remember the last time she was touched, except for when a carer came to change her. Can you imagine? Not being touched, not being hugged. The first things these children did when they met their friends was to run to them and give them a hug. The children ate with residents. They shared a picnic. Older people often eat alone. They were chosen as best friends, to the delight of the older residents. The 4-year-olds were choosing them as their best friends. Society cannot afford to ignore the challenges that aging brings. Depression is a major and a growing problem amongst our older generation. We have the opportunity to stem that tide. We can make choices. We, at this moment in time, can see what's happening around us and make that connection. When we looked at all of these older people, we saw that there were problems in doing the project. But we were asked questions, and questions have been asked about, well, what about health and safety? These 4-year-olds around older people. What about infection? What about staff treating little children, being expected to treat older people? The skill mix. Well, I know, and I'm telling you now, that these schemes have been run successfully across the world. Within the United States, on the continent, in Japan, and even in the UK. A new scheme started in London, very successful. The problems have been addressed. They can be ironed out. So, what do we do next? I say to you, find that local residential home near you. Find that older person living on their own, lonely, and start to make that connection. And some of you are probably still procrastinating and thinking, well, not so sure. Well, what I'd like you to do when you leave this room today is to get a calculator, or if you prefer, pen and paper. And I'd like you to go home and do a cost-benefit analysis of a hug. Thank you.